welcome to the Glazov gang. Tonight, Daniel Greenfield, a Shillman journalism fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center, who writes the blog The Point at frontpagemag.com. Daniel, welcome back to the Glazov gang.
Thank you. It feels like it was just last week.
It almost was. Daniel, so many horrifying and terrifying things happening almost everywhere. Let us begin with you starting to talk about what you think we should talk about.
Well, you know, there are way too many problems going on, but back in the United States, we're dealing with a border crisis, and the Middle East is essentially coming apart because of the lack of influence in Washington. Obama can still screw up America, but he's lost the ability to influence the rest of the world.
Okay, Daniel, let's, therefore, you mentioned the border crisis. I mean, this is just crazy. One of your latest superb pieces for Front Page, quote unquote, the title, Super Amnesty Will Turn Every City into Detroit. And what a scary article that was with all the facts you pointed out. Tell us a little bit about this in terms of what's happening with the border mess, everybody coming across, if they stay, if there will be amnesty, and all of a sudden every city will be Chicago or Detroit. Talk a little bit about that.
The push for amnesty is done through the lie that America has too many open jobs, there just aren't enough workers. You know, the amount of workers that aren't in the workforce and the unemployment rates show that clearly we don't have a surplus of jobs. What we have is a shortage of jobs. And if you keep pushing up the unemployment rates in major cities and you can tie that together to crime, you're going to have an entire disaster. You can look at the unemployment rates, for example, for black men in places like Detroit, places like Chicago. Those rates are very high. 50% of black men are unemployed in Chicago. The rate is even higher. I mean, 50% of black men are unemployed in Detroit. Only 1 in 4 black teens in Chicago have a job. So if we want to look at the kind of violence that we're seeing, the bloody shootings in Chicago over the weekend, you have to look at the fact that we have an economy, the Obama economy, that is a disaster, and you have a lot of people who are out of the workforce. And if they're out of the workforce, they're going to go into gangs, they're going to go into crime, they're going to sell drugs on the street corner, and there are going to be shootings. And all the talk about the NRA isn't going to change that.
Daniel, let's suppose that some people have not been following the news for 6 to 8 months. How would you concretely, very succinctly, briefly explain to them what's been happening on the border? Describe the situation.
We have an invasion. This is the sort of thing that Australia has been seeing for a while with massive migrant invasions. Europe has been seeing it. We've had extensive illegal immigration, but now, especially once Obama's dream amnesty illegally was carried off, we now have a massive invasion happening on the southern border. We're talking about large numbers of people entering the country. This is supposed to be a child, the left is emphasizing the child angle. A lot of these are teenagers. They're seeing graffiti from rather dangerous gangs showing up in detention centers. We were also seeing a situation where you have people who are basically renting kids who are going along with kids because they know that if they come with kids, they're more likely to just be released on their own recognizance and told to report to a center, which of course they never do.
But Daniel, at one time at least, the situation was that an illegal maybe snuck across the border and the border guards chased him down. Now what's happening is people are just strolling across the border and actually looking for the guards to set them up somewhere.
Obama turned the patrol into taxpayer-funded coyotes, as I believe Rush Limbaugh said. Their job is now to convey illegal aliens into the United States, give them whatever they want, and put them on a Greyhound bus. When Marietta, where the protests were going on, a spokesman actually said the humane thing to do is just basically find them a Greyhound bus, which you know is good news for anybody who likes to travel Greyhound and experience scabies, lice, and drug-resistant tuberculosis. You know, it's part of the Obama Greyhound package.
Daniel, if conservatives had been listened to, some of the really strong voices for a strong border security, a good defensive border that, protected the United States from illegal immigration, if this was listened to and certain measures were implemented over the years, would this even be happening today?
it wouldn't be happening if, for that matter, if Obama hadn't created a massive magnet through all this amnesty, which some people in the GOP certainly helped him create. Then none of this would be happening at all. We'd be seeing maybe existing illegal immigration, but we wouldn't be seeing this massive quantum increase.
Are
the
you
GOP basically played along with Obama, and in doing so, they created the perception that amnesty is just around the corner.
Daniel, so could it fairly be said, therefore, that this is actually staged? This is manufactured by the Obama administration, everything that's happening?
Well, they certainly knew it was coming. We've seen a contract based on that. They were certainly prepared for this. They expected it to happen. And now they've got it, and this is the leverage that Obama is now using. He's asking for $4 billion. Much of that will go to dramatically expanding the existing facilities, and that will push the next wave of amnesty. He's already been discussing increasing the existing Dream Amnesty tenfold, which would be an even huger increase and would bring a huge, even much bigger wave of invading illegals.
Daniel, what's the strategy and objective of Obama and his people in all of this?
Well, first of all, he's trying to disrupt the Republicans as much as possible. Second of all, obviously, they're thinking in terms of dramatically reshaping the country and creating a situation where a Republican could never become president again. And that's really the end game here.
Daniel, let us hypothetically suppose that for a moment, good people who love America somehow got into power at this very moment and called you and said, we need advice, we're going to start doing something about this right now. What is your recommendation, Daniel Greenfield, what we can do and what we should do?
Well, it's not like there are any new exciting ideas out there. The basic ideas have always been in place. Secure the border, deport illegal aliens. It's not like we're dealing with some complex, tangled mess where there's no notion of what we can possibly do about it. I mean, the United States has been doing border security for quite a while now. The Eisenhower administration used massive deportations when there were massive intrusions. They did massive border deportations again in the 1930s. The basic security tactics are there. We can secure the border. We can use the National Guard. We can put up a fence. We can actually finally begin enforcing the provisions of the 1986 amnesty and actually penalize employers who employ illegals. We can begin we've got massive amounts of illegal aliens actually coming out and protesting. They're not that hard to find and deport.
But Obama will not do this.
Well, they're his constituency. Why would he deport his constituency? I mean,
terrible situation, Daniel. Frightening situation. Let's go to another frightening situation, Hamas and Israel and everything that's happening there. Describe it for us and what your angle is on the events.
Unfortunately, Israel made the mistake of entering a peace agreement. Once it entered a peace agreement, it made the mistake of ceding territory. And ceding Gaza turned it over to Hamas. Ceding parts of the West Bank, allowing the creation of a PLO state there, created two sets of terrorist states. So now you have two terrorist states. And the obvious scenario is bad. I mean, if he had, as bad as our problems with Mexico are, at least Mexico isn't actually showing the United States. That's actually what we're seeing in Israel. You have Israel's lost control of its own territory. It's not able to actually act, or at least its leaders aren't going to act and drive out the terrorist groups. So this is going to keep repeating again and again until either Israel actually does what it has to do or until the situation turns much worse.
But at the moment, Israel is taking some concrete actions against Hamas.
It would be nice to think so, but essentially Israel is doing the same thing it does every few years, which is bomb some Hamas leaders, bomb some Hamas targets, and try to deplete some of Hamas's inventory. And so that means that Hamas will actually take another 2 years or so to restock with even bigger and more dangerous Iranian and Syrian weapons. And meanwhile, there'll be new commanders, and this whole thing will replay again, because until you actually get rid of Hamas, until you actually force Hamas out, this is just going to keep replaying again and again.
Your thoughts on the Obama administration's participation and involvement in that crisis?
Well, Obama administration crossed some red lines. It endorsed a unity government between the PLO and Hamas. That was a major game changer. It continues funding that unity government while denying that Hamas has anything to do with it. It's obviously providing no support to Israel. Instead, it keeps warning Netanyahu not to show restraint and not to go too far in attacking Hamas. So pretty much this is what we expect from an administration that was conducting back-channel talks with Hamas even before it came into power, and that's been conducting back-channel talks with Hamas all this year.
Daniel, again, hypothetically, let's suppose a new leader and military leaders, political leaders of Israel, at this very moment, a new leadership comes in and they bring you in and say, Daniel Greenfield, we are going to take action that you recommend. What would you recommend to them?
You have to roll back the status quo to before the peace process. You have to go back to the 80s, basically, when there was terrorism, but Israel had a certain amount of security. And you actually have to go back before that, because even back then, when Israel tried to expel 400 Hamas terrorists, there was instantly world condemnation, and Israel backed off, and that was a major mistake. That essentially saved Hamas. So you have to get rid of Hamas. You have to get rid of the PLO. You have to take out their top leaders, deport as many of the other ones as you can, and retake control over the West Bank and Gaza. Because if Israel doesn't do that, it's going to be faced with constant terrorist attacks from within its own borders.
Just a sec, where are you going to deport these terrorists to?
Well, these days, Syria seems like a really nice place. I mean, they should be able to fit in there pretty well. They can join either side of the civil war. It's up to them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Daniel. Now let's turn over to ISIS taking over large chunks of Iraq and how Obama literally threw Iraq away. Your thoughts?
Well, Obama administration chose to completely ignore all the bad news from Iraq because Obama announced that everything was fine, mission was accomplished, and we were all moving on. The Iraqis repeatedly warned him, U.S. intelligence repeatedly warned him, and again, he didn't want to hear it. There's a certain amount of a parallel now when he does the whole I'm not going to go to the border thing. The same way he didn't want to be associated with Iraq, he doesn't want to be associated with the border. When there's a disaster, his instinct is to just avoid it, and that's what he did with Iraq. And now we're seeing the consequences of that. And he's still not really doing anything significant about it. Instead, he's arming the Syrian jihadists, many of which collaborate with groups tied to ISIS, instead of actually doing the basic thing, which is conducting airstrikes against ISIS, because this is now the largest and most dangerous al-Qaeda franchise.
Daniel Greenfield, it would be correct and justified and legitimate to say that the Americans who are often killed with jihadist weapons, those weapons have been given to them one way or another through the Obama administration, right?
What the Obama administration began doing in Libya was it put an arms embargo on Libya, but at the same time it allowed Qatar, which is a major sponsor of Hamas, it's a major sponsor of the Syrian jihadists and ISIS and Al-Qaeda in general, to smuggle weapons in. It turned a blind eye, and this is not even some secret document somewhere. It's not a conspiracy theory. The New York Times actually wrote about this. Now it did the same thing again in Syria. So all they did was they asked that for the sake of plausible deniability, they shouldn't use American weapons. And despite that, they still managed to smuggle Stinger missiles to the Taliban in Afghanistan, who used it to shoot down the U.S. chopper. So the United States played a major role in seeing to it that these weapons came into the hands of terrorists in Syria and in Libya.
Daniel, you have a blog at The Point recently. Quote, ISIS, killing Shiites more important than killing Jews. So many massacres, genocide is underway on different levels. Tell us a little bit about this. We obviously know that the Sunni ISIS is going after, of course, Jews and Christians and infidels who get stuck in the way or caught in the way, but they're also going after Shiites, and in the blog you write that the Shia are often considered greater enemies than even Jews. Tell us a little bit about all this hatred.
Well, ISIS is a really progressive Muslim organization. It basically thinks that anybody who isn't a member of it is the enemy and can be killed, which is what's making Syria and Iraq such really exciting places these days. So they've announced now, obviously, the Sunnis and Shiites, since they're both Muslims, are in theory not supposed to be killing each other. So they need an excuse to explain why they're killing each other instead of killing Americans or Jews. So they announce that the other side really isn't Muslim, and the other side really works for the Jews. That's usually been the standard explanation. For example, Iran claims that ISIS is actually run by Israel. ISIS claims that Assad works for Israel. But now they've actually gone a step beyond that to say that killing the Shiites is not, ISIS has gone a step beyond it to say that killing Shiites is a priority, they can get around to getting killed by Israel later.
Daniel, Hillary Clinton and her defense many years ago that came out of the 12-year-old girl's rapist, and many lies that she's telling about how she defended that rapist. You wrote a blog on it the other day. Tell us a little bit how her narrative is changing.
This was not supposed to be an issue. Hillary thought that she had settled it in 2008, but then the Free Beacon did some research. They turned up a tape of Hillary having a good laugh about the rape of a 12-year-old girl, and her defense of the rapist was basically to say that the 12-year-old girl who had been beaten into a coma was lying, that she was promiscuous, that she was mentally ill. And this is about, you really have to be completely inhuman, a completely inhuman monster to even make that defense about a raped 12-year-old girl who had been beaten into a coma. So now Hillary has had to sort of try and explain it because there's a tape there of her laughing about it. So back in 2008, she tried to explain that she had to take the case. In fact, the tape reveals that she chose to take the case. The rapist had a lawyer. The rapist wanted a female lawyer because he thought it would help his defense. And Hillary chose to do it. She was not in any way compelled to do it. Now she's again claiming that she was compelled to do it, when again her own comments on tape show that she was not compelled to do it. So Hillary Clinton is trying to lie and claim that she was in some way obligated to do it. She was compelled to do it. In fact, none of that is true. But the interesting thing about the whole thing is that the American media has not asked her any tough questions. It hasn't asked her about it. But because her book sales have been so bad, she had to head to Europe to sell her book. And you actually have European outlets are asking the questions that American outlets won't, which is how we got this discussion in the first place.
Why is her book doing so badly?
Well, first of all, she already had a book out. One Hillary book is pretty much plenty. People really weren't that interested in a sequel, especially a sequel about nothing, because Hillary didn't do much of anything as Secretary of State, and about the only thing she can talk about is that she wasn't in any way responsible for Benghazi, and a book about It's Not My Fault is really not going to be that much of a bestseller. She didn't write the book. The book is, by all accounts, really boring, and it's basically a series of boilerplate excuses. And, who really wants to pay $30 for an excuse note?
And we can cover this show, Daniel, I think, with the title, The Heart of Leftist Darkness. Daniel Greenfield, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom on all these scary and depressing, terrifying events we see before us as the left is in charge in the United States. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.
But we're doing our best to bring good people and conservatives back into power, right?
That we are. We're doing our part.
Daniel Greenfield, thank you very much, and we hope to see you again soon. And thank you, the viewers of the Glazov Gang, for joining us. We'll see you again next week. Good night.